Shalom, and welcome to our History Podcast. This is a production of KingdomPreppers.org. I'm your host, Kingdom Prepper, and you're listening to Churchianity, 2,000 Years of Leaven. We continue with our history. Part 22, Wycliffe and Huss. The flaws of the church, though evident at its very foundation, were most apparent at its apex, as the leadership revealed through a string of venalities and controversies culminating in the so-called Babylonian captivity in Avignon, as well as the Great Schism, that Christianity was a corruption of truth from the top down. Attempted internal reforms, such as those brought on by general councils, otherwise known as the conciliar movement, failed. The concept of the papacy being the earthly ecclesiastical office to channel the will of the Most High became an absurdity to a few. Among the men who challenged that long-held viewpoint were John Wycliffe and John Huss. Wycliffe was alive during the papacy's Avignon period and died after the beginning of the Great Schism in 1384. Huss was condemned and burnt at the stake as a heretic at the Council of Constance. A prior pre-Reformation reform was attempted around 1173 by a man named Waldo, who was a merchant that decided to give all his wealth to the poor. He taught on the streets of Lyon and believed the Christian leadership to be thoroughly corrupt. To his understanding, the scriptures were to be made accessible to all. Thus, he had them translated into French. While he did not directly oppose the church, but sought to reform it, he was forced from Lyon and so took his message throughout the middle portion of France. Those who believed his preaching and followed him were called Waldensians. That movement was quickly suppressed, however, and they were forced underground to worship in poor regions of the Alps, Bohemia, and other areas. Therefore, as Will Durant writes in his book The Reformation,
the Reformation really began with John Wycliffe in the 14th century, progressed with John Huss in the 15th, and culminated explosively in the 16th with the reckless monk of Wittenberg.
That being Martin Luther. John Wycliffe, who preceded him, was either lauded by men of his day for his zealous nature or villainized for that very nature, which led him to take a strong stance against the church. His early life is obscured in the shadow of history, but he bears the name of the Yorkshire village where he was born and raised, Wycliffe-on-Tees in northern England. His family owned land in that village, and by the time he was 12 or thereabouts, the village fell under the jurisdiction of the second son of King Edward III, John of Gaunt, who would later figure prominently in Wycliffe's life. In 1345, he landed at Oxford, where he enrolled as a student at around 15 years of age. Wycliffe, who became famous for his bookish learning and keen logic, left the school briefly to enter politics in service to the crown. England was establishing itself as a nation at the time, so this was a crucial period. English had become the language of the elite and the government, replacing Norman French, and the burgeoning nation passed statutes that aimed to limit papal interference in its ecclesiastical elections. King Edward III would use his authority to appoint Wycliffe to the parish of Lutterworth, where he preached until his death. Wycliffe earned a doctoral degree in 1372 and became a prominent professor at Oxford. A heavily debated topic at the time was the idea of the right of dominion over men. Professors at Oxford were already questioning this matter when Wycliffe added an important equation to it. His view was that the English monarchy retained the power, by divine right, to check the authority of the church leadership, particularly when they abused their offices through some sinful act. The property of the clergy should be seized if they proved corrupt. In 1377, Wycliffe's teaching was condemned by the Pope, and it took the intervention of his influential English friends to prevent the Pope from taking further action against him.
Any cleric living in a state of mortal sin would inescapably have forfeited his claims to ecclesiastical dominions or lands,
writes Kevin Madigan in Medieval Christianity.
These, Wycliffe concluded, could then be taken, with justice, from the church by civil and secular rulers. This conclusion won Wycliffe the appreciation of the nobility, of many ordinary critics of clerical wealth, and even of the mendicant orders, who of course wished, at least in theory, for those living the apostolic life to be poor. Bishops and popes were considerably less exuberant, Indeed, in 1377, Wycliffe was summoned to appear before an assembly of bishops in London. They wanted him to defend his views in person. In the event, he was protected by John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and the proceedings never took place. The same year, Pope Gregory XI, perhaps encouraged by Benedictine antagonists of Wycliffe, published a list of 18 errors in Wycliffe's works. They also called for his examination and arrest. Again, Wycliffe was protected by powerful figures.
In 1378, when Wycliffe's reforming efforts deepened, the Great Schism of the papacy was getting underway. The schism was the perfect fodder for Wycliffe's push for church reform. Like the early monks, Wycliffe saw the excesses and worldly luxuries of the papacy as the antithesis of the lowly Israelite emissaries to whom they often pointed. In view of those poor and humble men, neither should popes possess political power. With two rival popes seeking to excommunicate the other and claim legitimacy, John Wycliffe vented his disparaging view of the papal office. "The Messiah
is truth,"
wrote Wycliffe.
"The Pope is the principle of falsehood."
While Yeshua lived in poverty, he added that,
"The Pope labors for worldly magnificence."
And where Yeshua refused temporal dominion,
"The Pope,"
he wrote acidly.
To listen to the full audio of this podcast, or to download a free MP3 version, visit our website, kingdompreppers.org, by clicking the link in the description, and journey with us on this important historic odyssey.